It's always fun to imagine what something looked like way back in the past, but it's even cooler to see it right in front of you on the page. Sometimes if you want to go backwards, you gotta go forwards a little bit. So here's a super sped up version of our sketch from today. But we're not going to be sketching this view from today. We're going to be sketching it from more than 60 years ago. Watercolor is cool because you can sketch whatever, whenever you want. And that means that if we wanted to, we could sketch this view from the 1950s. If you take a closer look, you can really see these are actually quite different. And the biggest thing, aside from a little bit of a change in vehicle, although even that's not too different, is this massive glacier, which is mostly missing from this one. So we'll actually be able to paint that in today, and once we fill this in, the contrast will be really cool between these two. So I'm going to get rid of these and let us jump right in, just like the rest. So this one, like those others, is going to be a lot of ice, although we are going to add some nice fall colors in this one as well. So I'm going to dive in with a little bit of that cerulean blue, that kind of nice glacial ice blue, just adding those little bits of blue right to those icebergs, a little bit in the middle as well, but you've done this before, so you know what you're doing. Just touching them up. This is a great way to start any painting because you really can't get it too wrong. Just something like that. Nice, easy, simple. Then I'm going to come up here, same with these mountains right here. Just a touch right on the sides. This one has a little bit of mountain snow left because it's the fall, but soon that is going to be totally covered. And then we have this massive glacial face. And so this is kind of interesting because in the 50s, this actually came right down. So the visitor center didn't exist, but just looking out from the kind of gravel moraine bar, you could see all of this glacier right up there, which would have been just stunning. And we're going to paint it in 3 phases. The first is going to be these light colors. So we're just going to stick with that cerulean blue we've already got, or whatever blue you have, something light and cool. And we're going to just add maybe a touch of shadow or something like that right there. Nothing too wild. And then maybe just a couple little bit of lines. It's almost like an accordion kind of coming down. But you can kind of see just a few little stripy lines like that. Something just to give it a bit of structure and show how it's scooting down. Right here, we are going to add a little bit darker. So we're actually going to have some nice contrast with those icebergs, but we're going to add that once everything is kind of dry. So you just need maybe a couple little lines or something like that, and you're going to be good to go. There is a little bit of a kind of dirty streak that it kind of pulls through. Bit of a kind of line of dirt that this glacier has kind of scraped out, and that's been there since the 50s. So we can add a touch of that if we want now. That would just be a bit of burnt sienna and maybe just a little bit of that line, something like that, kind of moving down. It just gives the glacier a little bit more dimension. But high up in these mountains, there's like a hill or something like that, and this glacier is just slowly sanding it down, and that's what you're seeing. That's how these glaciers carve those big, big valleys. So now that we've got a lot of those down, and whether you do a lot or a little, this is kind of up to your own taste. Let's add in this car and a little bit of this sidewalk here before we fill in the sky. Now, the funny thing is this really wasn't a sidewalk. You can see these ones where it very much is a sidewalk, but that's because the visitor center is relatively new compared to this glacier. Well, I mean, the glacier is ancient, but the visitor center is not going to be around here in the 50s, so it's actually a bit of a gravel bar. I'll do that with just a little bit of brown. Honestly, the same kind of colors as the sidewalk. Maybe just a bit more brown if we want. But just adding a little bit right up to the edge, and then I'll add a bit of blue on top of that. Simple and easy, but it's kind of wild how you change one thing, like the time zone or the time period, and all of a sudden everything is kind of a bit different. The cool thing is to think just how many people actually probably painted this glacier even in the 1950s. Cameras were everywhere, of course, but I feel like there's a little bit more sketching back then. In fact, my grandmother actually sketched Portage when you could see it from the visitor center. It's kind of a wild story for later. Now that we have a little bit of that gravel bar, or if you're just finishing it up, I'm going to start on this little car right here as well. And just to make sure that it doesn't bleed into the gravel bar, I'm just going to use a bit of tissue paper just to touch that edge maybe. Sometimes that's how I just make sure that things are dry enough. You can also just avoid it if you want, but I wasn't quite that clever in my planning. A little bit of red here, just because I kind of wanted to keep the same color scheme as the other car. I'm going to get a nice bit of red, and then when we come in and add that water, then this red will really pop. So here we go, a little bit of red on our car. If I was more of a car person, I actually know what kind this is. I was looking at some old photos just to make sure I got a little bit of the right shape in there, but cars, like people, if you don't quite know how to do them well, I just suggest doing them nice and small, and then they kind of look a little bit like everything. But it gives us a little bit of scale too, even though that glacier's so far back, well, farther now, but even though it's so far back right now, it kind of makes us appreciate the scale and how big it is. Okay, so now that we have all of that, we've got these pieces up here, which would be next, and we could do the sky or the mountains, and both of them, we don't really want them to touch. Although, one quick thing is if you want, you can always just put a little bit of a line of snow right here, and then you can kind of do both of them together. I'll show you that trick whenever I'm painting in the field and I need to be quick, and I don't want things to touch. You just add a little bit of snow like this. Nobody is the wiser. Aside from you, but don't tell anybody. There we go. Now I've got a little bit of a snow line on the edge. You probably get some of that in the fall, but not always, but that's okay. So now that we've got that, let's add in our little bit of the kind of fall foliage, grass kind of moving up there, which is going to be a little bit different of a tone, but still a beautiful, beautiful color. And what that's going to look like is a little bit of sort of green around here, but it does kind of end in this rocky part. And of course, you can always bring back our painting from earlier if you want those to kind of line up well. So let's add maybe a little bit of orange into this one. I'm going to start with some yellow. Maybe I'll even mix in some red right now. And that gives us orange. Pretty basic one, but I love how just a little bit of mixed colors just kind of bloom on that page. There we go, a bit of orange. Kind of trying to go spring, summer, fall. Not doing the best job always, but a little bit of orange, maybe a little bit of brown, somewhere a little bit in here. Kind of looks like orange actually. And then by the time we get down to the bottom, that's going to be just a little bit more dark. Of course, you can always add a tiny bit of green as well. Kind of just all of the colors, you know. But mostly I'm just going to make sure that it does line up with this one. So whatever colors you sketched over there, you're going to want them to line up a little bit. Adding my brown now in toward the top. But you're kind of just making a little bit of a calico cat of a mountain, you know? A little bit of everything. Kind of painting du jour. A little bit of brown up here. And then we'll come in with those purples and those indigos. This is just sort of that base layer. Can't go too wrong with it. There we go. And while that's still wet, so moving really fast here, adding in some of that purple. Grabbing a little bit, touching right to the edge, and just a touch of purple right here down the edge. Same up here, just a touch. Working over to the side, and voila. Look at that. Those two perfectly matched. Although whatever you did previously, just make sure you do that. So if this mountain is red, you can make this one red as well. All right, now just working down a little bit. And I'm moving so fast because while the water is wet, I'm just gonna kind of leave this out there and you'll see it'll kind of mix and smooth. It'll look great. My edges where there's snow, I'm gonna wanna touch a bit of purple too as well. I think a lot of that is just because as it melts, it kind of slowly wets the ground around it. Or in this case, probably just gives the foliage a little bit of water, but it always seems like it's slightly darker around the snow. That's looking nice and colorful. And then finally, let's add maybe a little bit of blue or a little bit of brown around this edge, just because where those glaciers touch, it's usually a lot more rock, a lot more bare. And actually, Portage was even melting back then in the 50s. Portage has been melting pretty early on, and it's kind of one of the exceptions of a lot of these glaciers. But the acceleration really picked up, partially because of the water. It was kind of hiding all of that water, almost freezing it down to the, this deep, deep lake. But having that access to water, all of a sudden it could basically move this conveyor belt of ice a whole lot more fast. So it's kind of one of these amazing geological features where it's a little sad to see it go so quick, but it's also just impressive to know how much has changed. Okay, just a touch of brown right there. And that's looking pretty good to me. Only things you might add, maybe just a little bit of blue or something like that right to the edge, just to give it some of that contrast, even purple. But for the most part, that is an awesome start to our glacier. And we're going to come back in here and add some of those darker colors here in a moment once this is dry. But I guess now would be kind of an interesting time to share about my grandmother, because when she painted it, you could actually still see this glacier, but it took me a little bit of time to actually find where she stood for a funny reason. My grandmother's actually the one who inspired me to sketch in the first place. She's an amazing artist who traveled all over the world, including Alaska, decades before I was born. I had one of her old sketchbooks of Portage, and I wanted to try to bring it back and find exactly where she stood to make the same sketch from the same place. And you could tell that the color of those icebergs really stood out to her as well. It was a quick sketch, so I assumed she was probably just passing through, maybe stopped at the visitor center. But when I got there, something didn't quite line up. And I'm not just talking about the missing icebergs or glacier. It was the trees and mountains. They just seemed to be a little bit off. Of course, my grandmother had artistic license, but when you spend time in a place and you sketch it, part of that place kind of gets locked in the page. So I went in search of answers. The visitor center has tons and tons and tons of good resources, and they were able to point out that the visitor center wasn't actually there when she came by and sketched. In fact, where we were standing, where the visitor center was, would have been a giant pile of glacial moraine, which is kind of like a gravel bar that the glacier pushes up. So I headed down to the other viewing area, which is closer to the tunnel and would have been around when she visited. This is definitely a good place to drive to. It was a bit of a bushwhack. But eventually, I started to see those trees creeping back into frame. And by the time I got to the middle of the bridge, all of a sudden, there it was. That same view from the sketch, lining up like a missing puzzle piece. The mountains, the trees, except back then you could see Portage Glacier from this bridge. So I pulled out my sketchbook to make a sketch where she stood decades ago. It was wet and rainy and cold, but I wanted to get a quick little something on a page, because when you spend time looking at a place and sketching it, a little piece of that place gets locked in. And with everything moving so fast in the world, I just wanted a little piece of this time, just to hold on to, and maybe inspire my grandkids one day to go visit this amazing spot. Now that most of this is dry, we can move on to the rest of these little details, but look how already that water just kind of smoothed out and moved around that mountain. Really fun fall look. All right, let's start with the sky. It's big, it's giant, it's there, it'll take a bit to dry, so let's jump right in. Adding a bunch of water here. I might even just add a little bit just there, just because I know it's going to have to be smoothed around, but mostly I just need a big old brush full of whatever our sky blue is, which is conveniently the same color of our glacier blue. This sketch brought to you by this color. Or no, it's more like Sesame Street or something. The color of the day is this one. Just adding in a bunch of this blue right here. Really just ladling it on. It will dry a little bit lighter, so depending on what your other sky looks like, you can kind of try to match those if you want, but it'll also look good almost no matter what. That's another beauty of these little tiny borders, is all of a sudden things are a little bit more forgiving. I'm just got a little bit of green into that one. Okay, there we go. Just a nice big brush full, moving down onto our glacier. The sky was still blue in the 1950s, I think. We should be pretty accurate on that. Okay, a little bit down here, and right to the base of the glacier. And we'll be able to jump right into the rest. It is kind of fun to think too, even though we're going to be jumping across seasons in this, how the sky will absolutely remain the same. A little bit less light, but at noon, not too bad. Okay, so we've got our glacier right here, and there are actually some kind of darker lines. We've got our nice light ones, but we are going to be adding a little bit more of that darker kind of shades and colors. So I'm going to grab just a touch of indigo. That's kind of my sort of dark blue-ish color. But I'm going to get a little bit watery because I do kind of want to move it around a bit. And so within each of these kind of broad strokes, sometimes I'll add just a little touch like this. Something like that. Not worrying too much. Maybe I'll follow the lines of kind of the little dirty streak that kind of goes down. But it just adds a little bit more depth. So I got the big one, and then maybe a couple little ones. So something kind of like that. Maybe a few there. It really did kind of widen flat, and it's actually pretty far away, but once we add just a little bit of detail like that, we're going to come down right here to where it touches the base and then add kind of a whole little layer. You can do indigo, you could do kind of a light blue, but you can see I'm going to kind of add just a little bit of that layer, just like that, just to kind of separate those two and also separate those icebergs out a little bit. Right there, piece by piece, until we have just a little bit of depth. It doesn't look like a ton, but it does make a difference, doesn't it? Grabbing a bit of water here and then blotting it off just a tiny bit, and then I'll come back up and maybe add just a bit of water to the top edge just to smooth things out. That's a nice easy trick, because you can always just add a bit of water to the top, kind of smooths everything out. If there's ever a rough patch in your life, just start with a little bit of water. Can't hurt. Okay, just like that, and there we go. And I should say already, look at the difference between these two. I mean, it's kind of fun how similar they are, but also just how different what we're seeing is already. But we still have a little bit until we can fully kind of appreciate all of that. So down here, we have that big kind of glacier-y snow, kind of melted water, but that's going to be something we'll add in right at the last because we want this to be relatively dry before we do it. So let's start with a little bit of a shadow below our car, a little bit of indigo, sort of the dregs of whatever I had right there, and then you can see here, it seems small, big deal, just a little bit of a line touching all of those wheels. It doesn't take much, but it does make a big difference. Right there, looks great. And then I gotta pick the color of my bumper and my wheel right there. I could make them both kind of some indigo. Maybe I will for continuity. But you can make them kind of any color you want. A little bit indigo right there. And I'll use this back wheel. Just adding a touch right here. Just to kind of get at some there. And then that bumper. Just a tad. These windows too are going to be kind of nice and dark. So while you got it on your brush, maybe we'll use a tiny bit of indigo right there as well. But we're just kind of adding those last little details, so you can make them kind of as detailed and as dark as you want, because the eye is going to be drawn to them, so it's worth spending a tiny bit of extra time. Wiping off that brush. I'm not forgetting those tires, I'm just kind of waiting till things are dry. And then maybe even I'll add a tiny bit of yellow or something to those little back headlamps. Just something like that. That looks great. Okay, so now that that's relatively dry, or at least this side looks relatively dry, and you can see it kind of dried a bit lighter, let's add a little bit to this kind of big area right here, matching it pretty closely. So we could use a tiny bit of blue, but mostly we're using that kind of dark blue in the background. We make that by a bit of green mixed in with a bit of light blue. Like I said, color of the day, this blue right there. And I'm just going to add a bit down here by the base. Just kind of a little bit, and then we'll add that dark blue in the top and let those two connect. piece by piece. This is kind of the detailed part. But you've done such a good job at this point. It's also where the nerves kind of come in, because, you know, if you're going to ruin a painting when you first started, it's like, well, who cares? I haven't put any time into this. But this is looking so good now. It's like the pressure is real. But you're going to do great. Adding a bit of that dark blue to my palette now. This is maybe ultramarine, maybe Prussian, some kind of darker blue. And then adding that right to the top while it's still wet and has a chance to kind of bleed and blend. Hoping that that top glacier layer is dry enough so that we get nice crisp lines, but if you don't, that's okay too. Beautiful. How fun is that? A couple more, and then right here, we're gonna start to see all of this kind of fit into place. One more down here, just to make sure it's all connected, all moving. And then you can kind of step back and let the water do its job. That is looking really good. Once again, just take a look at these two. How interesting is that? Just the before, well, I guess the after and before. It's really one of those things, it's hard to see with your own eyes. I mean, I had to go on a trip to Portage myself really just to appreciate how much change there's been. But it's kind of wild when you actually sketch it out. And not even, 1950, that's just an extreme example. But this has changed a ton as well in the last decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. Okay. Now let's add in those last little wheels. Looks like everything's dry down there. Tiny bit more indigo. Just a touch of those last little wheels right below the car. And then maybe just a touch in those glaciers, just like we did before, if you remember, where we had those sort of light patches and then we just add just a touch of that darker blue. Something like that right there. Doesn't take much, which kind of helps distinguish them. Very distinguished icebergs. Long since melted. But just like a time machine, in this case made out of paper, we're able to kind of bring it back to 1950. And there you go. Portage in the fall, 1950 and today, but we are 3 down, only 1 to go, and already this panorama is really coming together. And so if you stuck with it this far, you're doing amazing. I cannot wait to see this completed and dive into winter next, where you have an entirely different way to experience a frozen wonderland that is Portage and its glacier.